Today we're talking about how to get into Japanese literature. Now for this video I had to somewhat resist the urge to go a bit too deep cuts into Japanese literature. I actually spent most of my 20s living in Japan. I lived in Tokyo and Yokohama, and it was kind of, the country was a second home to me. So I got really familiar with the literature, I got really familiar with the manga, and it's a real different style of writing, like for two reasons. One, it seems by Western sensibilities that Japanese literature is kind of like boring, like there's not too much going on. And this is very much a reflection of the cultural difference, specifically between American literature and Japanese literature. British sensibilities are actually quite close to Japanese, more than to American in my opinion, which, you know, maybe people might not agree with, but that's what my experience has told me. So basically a lot of the stuff in Japanese literature, a lot of the character dilemmas, not in all the books, but in a lot of them, is very kind of hidden by our Western standards. Like, we're quite overt and we need a lot of sensationalism and we need a lot of overt conflict, but a lot of the conflict in Japanese literature is simmering below the surface, so it can seem like nothing's really happening, and there's a lot of heavy emphasis in a lot of Japanese works on the passing of time and, you know, looking at people and trying to analyse what they're thinking, what their life's all about, and there's no real overt conflict in a lot of books. This is not true for a lot of the more modern books coming out of Japan, like there's some of the detective fiction that's really popular is really quite overt in that. Anyway, there's a cultural difference. You sense this when you live in Japan, when you talk to Japanese people. There's this concept of Yukio Mishima, which is like reading the air. Like, you talk to a Japanese person and ask them about their politics, you're not going to get a straight answer. You're not going to know their extreme opinions, or they're just going to mirror back anything that you say. This is the same for religion, pretty much. People kind of keep themselves to themselves, and so there's a lot of mind reading necessary in Japanese culture, and this is kind of the same with books as well. But what this does, at least as someone who's been living in England for a little while now, this is remedies something that I kind of need. I need a bit of stillness and quiet, and I need a bit of nuance and gentle probing. I'm very tired of noise and sensationalism and speed, so I've returned to Japanese literature, and I would like to give you a couple of recommendations. These are somewhat mainstream recommendations, at least by an expert standard. Someone who's a connoisseur, someone who's an expert in Japanese literature might dismiss these and say, well, that's just amateur hour, but hey, if you've never read Japanese literature before, I think these are the perfect books to start with. Okay, so the first author, you already know him, he's Haruki Murakami. He's the most popular author, I think, to come out of Japan since ever. He used to, maybe like 20 years ago, have a sort of cult reputation. It used to be that the cool kids, the hip kids would read Murakami, but he's massively mainstream now. And Murakami, he's a bit odd, I would say, and that's probably an understatement. He's very, I don't know if you'd call it magical realism, but he has a real surrealist absurdity. You can tell that he's been raised on sort of 50s black and white crime noir thrillers, with a shitload of surrealism thrown in as well. For Murakami, I'm going to make 3 suggestions of where to start, and then it's up to you how weird you want to go, how deep down the tunnel you want to go. My first suggestion is simply start with a collection of his essays, what I think about when I'm running. These are some of the most nice, tender, nuanced, passionate, evocative, personal essays I've ever read. They're all about marathon running, and you kind of get illumination into his life as a writer, but also as a runner, and kind of how he puts himself in sort of a hypnotic trance for art's sake. It's a really nice collection of essays, really easy to read, you'll speed through it. Next, I would recommend After the Quake, which is very, very slim. You could read that in a day. It's a collection of sort of semi-related stories of people in Japan after the Kobe earthquake. If you know anything about the Kobe quake, it was devastating. This collection of stories is very evocative. It's not as weird as Murakami can be. It shows off his style of characterization. Obviously, if you want to pursue a bit further, I'd recommend his collection Men and Women, which is a short story collection, and not all of them are super strange either. There's 1 or 2 that are a bit odd. The next one I'd recommend, and this is one of my favourite novels of all time, is Norwegian Wood. This is the most tender, heartbreaking, nuanced, pathos and nostalgia-filled work of staggering tragedy I've ever read, or at least one of them. And again, it's Murakami trying to wrestle with realism, because he was charged with only being able to do these ultra sort of strange, weird, absurdist fantasies, which are really good. But if you like Norwegian Wood, that doesn't mean you'll like the rest of his stuff. After that, you can dive in, you can check out Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, which is actually the book that broke a spell of non-reading for me. After I graduated from Oxford, I was just sick of books. I didn't want to see another book, and I didn't read for a year. And then the book that I picked up that got me back into reading again was Hard-Boiled Wonderland. It's really odd. So yeah, it's an obvious choice, but I would recommend Murakami. Obviously, if you're talking about Japanese literature, you have to talk about Murakami. Can't help it. There's another Murakami, by the way, Ryu Murakami, who wrote books like In the Miso Soup and Audition. You might have seen the Takashi Miike film version of Audition. Basically, if you want sick, creepy, horrible horror, go for Ryu Murakami. But there's no connection, there's no aesthetic comparison between Haruki Murakami and Ryu Murakami. My next recommendation would be Yasunari Kawabata, and I would recommend Snow Country. But people in the know will obviously debate with me about which is the best entrance point to this Nobel Prize winner's work. Kawabata has some really gorgeous, nuanced, simmeringly gentle sensibilities. This particular novel is very slow moving, and it's about a relationship between a wealthy patron of a hot spring town. Like, if you don't know about Japan, there's a lot of hot spring towns. Deep in snow country, I assume this is near Hokkaido, which is heavy snow most of the year. And he patronizes this inn, and he befriends or starts a relationship with a geisha. Very, very gentle work, very, very beautiful, and you can kind of see why Kawabata was awarded the Nobel Prize. If you want to start with a short story, try Yasunari Kawabata's The Grasshopper and the Bell Cricket. That's in a collection called Palm of the Hand Stories. And this story, and just like the rest of the stories in the collection, it's very haiku-like. It's this idea of sort of one metaphor or one snapshot, naturalistic, shisei, some sort of image of nature. It's very poetic, and obviously, if you know anything about Japanese, the Japanese writing system, they write using kanji, which is pictographic in nature. So this naturally lends a lot of Japanese works to being very imagistic. Ezra Pound called this phanopia. This is one way of charging language with meaning by projecting an image, a visual, onto the mind's eye. And the Japanese, along with the Chinese, are supreme at doing this. I recommend that short story collection, and you'll see if you read that story, just like you'll see if you read Snow Country, or Yukiguni, as they say in Japanese, you'll see why he was awarded the Nobel Prize. Kawabata got the Nobel Prize in 1968, and the reasoning behind that was, and I quote, "for his narrative mastery, which with great sensibility expresses the essence of the Japanese mind." If you like nostalgia, if you like melancholy, if you like beautiful craftsmanship, Yasunari Kawabata is very much worth pursuing. Don't just take my word for it, don't take Snow Country. You can pick any of his works, and I'm sure you'll find something that strikes a chord with your soul. Next recommendation, we've got Yukio Mishima, and this is the sailor who fell from grace with the sea. Mishima was passed over for the Nobel Prize, and his, this descendant of samurai, his life ended quite tragically. I mean, he wanted his life to end tragically, I suppose. But before his life ended, he was able to craft some really gorgeous soul pieces, and I would imagine, although again people are divided on this, I would imagine The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea is one of Mishima's best works, or at least one of the best works to start with. But to be honest, you can plump for anything by Mishima, and I would also recommend his short story collection, and you would do well with it. Again, these are all books that are very, very slim volumes. You can read them in one night, and what a lovely night you will have if you do so. I would also like to recommend Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa, and this is a big book. It was serialized, and it ran in a newspaper, maybe Asahi Shimbun, I can't remember which one. But it's about this warrior called Musashi. You might have heard of Musashi. This is very, very evocative, it's very stirring and rousing. It's an adventure story really, but with a ton of philosophy. It's actually really practical as well. It's very poetic, but you can make the poetic practical. Is it the most poetic work that comes out, that has ever come out of Japan? No, probably not. It's not exactly basho, and if you want to look at some haikus, I'd recommend basho. But it's a rip-roaring read. It's the sort of book where you could just read it over years. I've not finished it. I started reading it years ago. I dip into it every now and then, and I don't want it to end. There was also, and I'm sure there's been loads of adaptations of this, Vagabond, which is a manga, a really good manga. It's by the same artist who did Real and what's the other one? Slam Dunk. And the drawing style is just gorgeous, very violent. Very evocative, but also very faithful as well to the Musashi story. So if you want the manga version, I would highly recommend it. It's a great read. And finally, I'm going to recommend something, I'd say it's modern, but this is actually just modern because of the translation. I think this came out in the 70s, and if you like dystopian fiction, if you like Hunger Games, if you like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, if you like The Giver, if you like any of that dystopian stuff, then you'll probably get a huge kick out of The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. The Memory Police, the characters are living in this locale where things can just be erased from memory one day. Like, one day perfume doesn't exist. One day a type of rose just disappears off the face of the earth. But what happens when you don't forget what used to be around? Beautiful, haunting, traumatic, compelling. You'll read this very, very quickly. And this particular translation, who is this translation? Translated from the Japanese by Stephen Snyder. Really, really good. I recommend that as well. Anyway, I could keep going all day. That's a beginner starter kit. That's a flat pack to Japanese literature. That'll get you started and get you reading some good books. You could read all those books in a week and you'd be well on your way to really understanding the Japanese spirit and essence. If you'd like more Japanese literature recommendations or to go deep cuts, please let me know in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed this content, you might like hardcore literature. That's my podcast, and we also have a sister channel where I deep dive into different works. Just recently I started a new series analysing the reading lists of the famous icons through history. We've done Marilyn Monroe, Jim Morrison. Just recently I released an analysis of David Bowie's favourite books, 100 favourite books. So check out hardcore literature, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe, and I'll keep making more. Thank you very much for reading. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu. 読んでくださいね。